I'll wait until 11. We went a bit early. So yeah, to the speakers, we're actually live and recording now, but we'll just wait until 11 to let some of the participants log on.
Okay.
Okay. Yoshi, do you have the number of people that are live? Yeah. I think I learned only to the speakers. Yeah. Maybe it's... So good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all today to the Digital Summits hosted by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. If you're joining us this morning, you are already part of the Global Landscapes Forum community, or likely part of the Forest and Landscape Restoration Mechanism community. And if so, welcome back to all of you. To those who are new and joining us for the first time, as well, a very big welcome. We're excited to have you join us today for the Digital Summits. We do have a full house. We have about 5 or 6 speakers this morning, so we are going to start pretty sharply as we have a bigger group than normal. And so as people begin to sign in and join the discussion, I'd like to just address a few housekeeping things. Many of the participants who have registered in the polling section described that this was their first digital summit. And so in order to get the most out of the session, we'll just do a really quick overview of some of the features of the Crowdcast platform. So the first thing I want to point out is at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a chat box. And very shortly, we'll be asking the participants online to write their name and perhaps their relation to the topic in the chat box. Secondly, you'll see a poll section. And so the poll section will, throughout the discussion, colleagues here at FAO will be posting a few polling questions, and feel free to take part in any of the polls that you like. It's just an opportunity for us to understand where some of the participants are coming from and what's their background. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, you'll also see an Ask a Question section. So that's where we'd like you guys to pose your specific questions to each of the panelists in relation to their area of expertise, or even in relation to your area of interest. In the Ask a Question section, there is a feature to upvote questions. So perhaps someone's already asked a question that you were thinking of, which would be great. You can just upvote the question, and we will be having a discussion or a question session at the end. But again, because we are a bit short on time, we'll be using that upvoting feature to perhaps decide on which questions will be prioritized. So hopefully that's clear enough. I hope you can navigate through the Crowdcast section. We do have two colleagues with us who are helping with the back end. So we have the Forestry Officer Yoshihiko Aga here with us at FAO, who will be curating the questions. And we have Senior Learning Officer Selina Abraham from the Global Landscapes Forum. And she'll also be working on the questions and helping us navigate the different speakers, because we do have many screens that will be popping up and popping off this morning. So that's just a quick bit of housekeeping to familiarize yourself with the platform. To begin the digital summit, we do have some opening remarks that were sent to us by the director of the Forestry Department here at FAO, and we'd like to start by showing those. So before we get into the discussion, into the meat and bones of the session, we'll just start with these opening remarks. So before we do that, actually, Selena, can we remove one of the speakers? Because I can't share a screen unless we remove one of the speakers from the session. Perfect, thank you. And we will share screen.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this digital summit on restoring ecosystems and reviving hope. Why are we doing this? Because throughout the world, there's about 3.2 billion people that are negatively affected by land degradation. And you know the cost in loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services is more than 10% of the gross product globally. And that's not counting livelihoods and food security of those depending on those resources. So we must and we can change that. So join us today in this event where we will discuss where, why, and how we can restore the habitats of the planet's plants and animals, and how we can restore the productivity of our landscapes and seascapes. And you can all help, so please join us.
Okay, I don't think we're sharing our screen anymore, which is great. So if we could also bring up one of the other speakers again. I think we dropped Tom off. But yeah, Meta was hoping to be with us this morning, but in her absence, we wanted to say a big thank you for sharing her opening remarks. Reflecting on what Meta has said, the most important aspect is that we do all have a role to play, and that you can all help in this upcoming decade of ecosystem restoration. And I really hope that's why you've joined us this morning. Perhaps you're a seasoned restoration expert, or a student just graduating. Perhaps you're part of a community NGO, or you play some other role. But we're all hoping to play a role in reviving hope and redefining our relationship with the land that this new decade will offer. So today we are discussing the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, a space that has had increasing attention from the international community, which has culminated in the recent UN General Assembly announcement of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration from 2021 to 2030, which is a great achievement, as the restoration of forests and natural ecosystems remains one of our most effective strategies for solving the climate and biodiversity crisis. So we need to use all of the tools in our toolbox. Of course, a lot of attention is focused on curbing deforestation, protecting the world's remaining biodiversity hotspots and biologically important areas. But really, is it enough? And I don't think it is. We need to move beyond that. We need to focus on concerted and urgent efforts to combat land degradation and its drivers. We have the opportunity to heal our relationship with the land and the natural capital from which all of our cultural, social, and economical wealth derives. The key messages that came out of the recent IPBES thematic assessment was clear. We have known and proven interventions, but it will only get more difficult the longer that we wait. So it's time to start implementing. And the decade provides us with a way to mobilize people and communities to radically change their landscapes over the next 10 years. So today we want to look at the intersection of the various elements of the restoration equation, if I may use that term. We want to discuss moving from pledges to implementation and to monitoring. We want to explore where we are and where we're going as we start this journey in preparation for the decade. And luckily for all of us, we have 5 speakers or experts joining us this morning who can help us explore and unpack some of these various elements. So to start, I'll ask each speaker to give a quick introduction to who they are, their relation to the topic, and we'll try to keep it to 1 minute maximum, again, given the time constraint with the number of speakers that we do have. For the participants who are joining us, as the speakers are introducing themselves, now would also be the opportunity for you to introduce yourself in the chat box. So take a moment to do so, and maybe we can start with Tim, who's joining us from Nairobi.
Yes, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Tim Christoffersen. I coordinate the Water, Land and Climate branch at UN Environment. I'm currently also the chair of the Global Forest and Landscape Restoration Partnership and the focal point for the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration here at UN Environment. We partner with FAO in preparing this decade. Much of what I'm going to say later is also summarized in this publication. I've sent a link through the chat already, so in case you want to read up on anything that I'm going to say later in a bit more detail, this is a publication by the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration and has more detail on that.
Great, thanks, Tim. Next, we can move to Matilda, who has worked her magic this morning and avoided some firewalls and is joining us from Beijing. So thank you for joining us, Matilda.
Yes, hello, good morning to good evening. I'm Mathilde Vance, and I work for the Forest and Landscape Restoration Mechanism from FAO. The team is mainly based in Rome, but I'm based in Beijing, and I'm taking care of all our Asia-Pacific portfolio. And I'm preparing, developing, and implementing forest and landscape restoration projects in the field, and this is what I would like to talk about today.
Great, thank you, Matilda. We're looking forward to exploring some of your experience on implementing FLR in the field. Next we'll move to one of the two colleagues from the University of ETH Zurich who are joining us. We'll start with Tom Crowther.
Hi. I'm Tom Crowther. I'm a professor of ecosystem ecology at ETH Zurich, and the lab we've established recently is we're aiming to generate a quantitative understanding of Earth's ecosystems, and not just what's there and how it interacts with the climate, but primarily we're focusing on understanding what is possible, what is the potential in terms of restoration, and how could we restore forests in order to capture carbon, and how much carbon could we restore around the world.
Great, thanks, Tom. And we're also joined by a postdoctoral fellow who's also a member of Tom's lab at Zurich. So we have Jean-François.
Yeah, so hello everyone. My name is Jean-François Bastin, and I'm, as Kelly said, I'm a postdoc of Tom, and so I'm an expert in remote sensing of vegetation and in forest ecology. And we work together with Tom on this estimation of the potential restoration of the planet and how forests can play a major role in the fight against climate change.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And joining me here today in Rome, in the same room, is the team leader of the National Forest Monitoring Team here in the Forestry Department, Julian Fox.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Julian Fox. I'm the team leader of National Forest Monitoring in FAO's Forestry Department, and we support countries on developing multi-purpose forest monitoring and land monitoring systems. And we've been doing this for several decades, but for the last 18 months, we've been focusing on, thanks to funding from the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry of Japan, on how we can monitor restoration. So my main interest and angle on this topic is how we can provide technical solutions and innovative ways to identify places to restore and then measure and monitor our restoration efforts. So thank you, Khalil. Thank you, everybody.
Great, thank you for joining us, Julian. And I myself, my name is Khalil Walji. I'm a consultant here at FAO with the NFM and REDD+ cluster in the Forestry Department. I'm like you guys, I'm not an expert in any one of these topics. I'm here to guide the discussion and help moderate, but I'm equally as excited to be joined by all these experts, and I hope we can have a fruitful discussion. I'm sure we will. So with that, we're going to jump straight into the discussion session. And again, as the discussion session is moving along, feel free to ask your questions, and then we'll address them later in a specific section for questions. Okay, so to start us off, maybe we can start with Tim. Tim, you've had quite a long history and background in the restoration space. You're also now co-leading the decade that's being run with FAO and UN Environment. For some of us joining today, maybe the announcement of the decade could have been a surprise, but there has been a steady and incremental growth for this movement with a greater political will, with global and regional relationships, such as AFR 100 and the Bonn Challenge. So perhaps you can give us just a bit of a background of how this momentum has been building over a longer time period and now culminated in an entire UN decade announcement.
Yeah, thanks, Khalil. And indeed, we have been working towards this point for quite a number of years, and steadily the momentum has been growing. There are tipping points in nature, but clearly there are also social tipping points, and we are very close to one or several of those now on climate action. We see with the Fridays for Future protests and other social developments that there's a huge appetite out there now that people are aware of the magnitude of the combined biodiversity and climate crisis and want to take action, but they don't know what to do or how to engage, how to participate. So I think this is the momentum that we'll be tapping in with the UN decade. And I think in one of the questions that you've prepared, you also say, but it only starts in 2021. What do we do tomorrow? And I think that is a good question because the momentum is already there. We plan to build the decade, therefore, not as primarily an awareness raising tool, but as a digital platform for everyone to participate. Whether you're a 10-year-old primary school student from northern Kenya or you're the president of the Society for Ecological Restoration, everybody will hopefully find a role, and we need to design the decade in a way that everybody has a role to absorb this this appetite for a mass movement. But how do we channel this energy into a useful direction? Because planting trees, for example, as one of the options that is much discussed, is more difficult than it sounds, because planting trees is only the beginning, and we like to talk about growing trees rather than planting trees, and it's one restoration option where a lot of things can go wrong. You can plant the wrong tree in the wrong place at the wrong time. You can use bad germplasm and the tree dies after a year, which then will alienate a huge stakeholder group like smallholder farmers who would try this once and it doesn't work, and they will never try it again. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong that we have to get right. So this, of course, where FAO mostly comes in with technical guidelines and guidance on the decade. UN Environment will more be responsible for designing that advocacy and communication platform and doing the outreach on the decade. That's how we will partner. But we're luckily building on a lot of knowledge that has been accumulated in this field already. I mentioned this publication earlier that summarizes basically 10 years of the experience of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration. On the marine and coastal side, because we have to remember this decade is for all ecosystems, we don't have that much experience, but there's a growing body of knowledge also on mangrove restoration, coral reef restoration, seagrass beds that we are tapping into. So yes, it's exciting times. We're building on about 10 years of concerted action towards this that has resulted in the Bond Challenge. It has resulted in regional restoration movements like the 20 by 20 in Latin America, the Africa Restoration 100 initiative, and we have other regional initiatives. So we're building on a momentum that has been growing for years, and I think now is close to a tipping point to become a mass movement. I'll leave it at this for now.
Yeah, a very great reflections there, Tim. I think many of the things that you mentioned focus around changing the narrative from this sort of negative landscape to an opportunity that we have. And how important do you think that is, that we're giving people the opportunity to see the problem with a solution in mind? And I know even a lot of the publications that you mentioned, the institutions that we're working with focus on changing the lens and the focus to an opportunity rather than a harmful cause.
Our communications experts have been trying to crack this conundrum of how to trigger climate action for a while now. And there is even a new emerging field called a climate psychologist that looks at the various layers of denial. And I think all of us, in a sense, are in some level of denial about the magnitude of this challenge, because the human psyche has defense mechanisms against trauma. And in a way, what's happening these days and years, we live in historic times, it is a huge traumatic event, that the threats we're faced with are so existential that the human mind has defense mechanisms. The way to bridge those and get to a point where this turns into action is by making it positive, do something that you can invest in, and by making it local. The global context of climate change, biodiversity loss is too abstract, it's far away for people, and the year 2100 that the IPCC uses, that's beyond most of our lifetime. So, it's far away. If you make this local and you make it about what is your neighbor doing, what is your community doing, what are your children learning at school, what are they doing, what are they asking their parents, then you get beyond that level of abstractness and the denial that is linked to that. So we have to make this a local movement that is globally coordinated with a number of core messages and products.
Yeah, no, very true. It sort of also mirrors the other challenge that we have in terms of taking these pledges and these commitments and making them locally relevant and making them locally specific. So it's interesting that the communication aspect also very much so mimics the actual work that needs to be done in terms of local specificity. Bringing it down to a local level is very important. Now, you mentioned it a little bit as well in your first statement, Tim, regarding the decade is not just about forests. We have to remember the seascapes. In the second thematic assessment from the IPBES, which was released last year, they really laid out the facts that 1/3 of wetlands have been lost in the past 40 years, half of grasslands, 2/3 of the forests also appear to be degraded, and 75% of the land surface is affected by human activity. So the decade won't just focus on forest landscapes. It appears that we can't get away from degradation. All ecosystems around us really are being impacted by the human. So how can we begin to work more across sectors, because it will be needed in order to achieve the objectives that the decade is really going to be laying out?
We can learn from the experience in forest and landscape restoration for other ecosystems. And I think we can do that at a number of levels. On financing, how to finance large-scale restoration, that will be very similar for different ecosystems. Building business cases based on ecosystem services will be similar regardless which ecosystem it is. There's also, of course, big differences, but the body of knowledge on social inclusion, on participation, on the landscape approach is something that is relevant across ecosystems, whether it's peatlands, wetlands, mountains, drylands. So we take these lessons, I think, from the GPFLR, from other movements, and will hopefully be able to make them available through the decade to anyone who wants to participate in a landscape restoration approach wherever she or he lives. I think that is a challenge that is ahead of us, and we will need a lot of volunteers for the decade, from volunteer translators who translate this into local languages to volunteers who are experts. We, for example, will have a number of task forces on reforming fiscal policies, on monitoring, on the types of things that Thomas and his team are working on. So there'll be a lot of opportunities to participate for people both at the expert level and at the citizen level.
Yeah, so on one hand, we have many tools already in our toolkit, but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of making this locally specific. Yeah, and I think that's a nice time to maybe pivot towards Matilde. Through Tim's introduction and through some of the background documents that are available within the FLRM space, we've seen many political commitments, 170 million hectares and 58 pledges with the bond challenge alone, upwards of 350 million hectares. Also reflections of restoration within the UN CBD targets, the UNCCD targets. But it's clear that political commitments don't always translate into implementation on the ground, at least not right away. So perhaps, Matilde, from your experience working on the ground in the Asia-Pacific region, can you tell us what are some of the common challenges that countries face in implementing restoration at scale? Just 1 second, your microphone's muted, so 1 second. There you go.
So I've seen actually that we have a little bit over 200 people who joined the call now, and a lot of them are coming from the field, from Rwanda, Philippines, India, and a lot of other countries. And I hope they will be able to share a little bit their experience later. But indeed, the commitments, the pledges are huge. How do we actually make that work on the ground? And how do we go from the pilots, everybody does pilots, and how do we actually upscale? I pointed out 7 things that I think are current barriers that should be uplifted if we really want to go to scale. And I will welcome your comments on I chose 7, but unfortunately there are many more. The first one is really coordination. We see in many countries that there is a lack of coordination between the different stakeholders, within the different governments, entities, inside the same ministries. I mean, it's very difficult for us to give lessons because I guess that each of us is in our own organization. Everybody is pushing for coordination, and it's one of the most difficult things to do in any organization. So it's not that the country are to blame, but we have to support more coordination, more integrated planning, and planning that is done with the people that will actually do restoration. So planning that is done with the community in a participatory way. This is really the top thing, improve coordination with people at all levels and with all sectors, because we see too often restoration that happens and then a major infrastructure development that comes just after and just destroy what is happening. So it's not about talking only with people that are have the same opinion as us, but also others that have a strong impact on the landscape. So that will be the first one. The second one will be really working on the institutional framework. We see in the field that one of the top issue is land tenure. Because when you do restore land, then who is gonna be taking care of this land in the long term? What are the incentives for people to actually restore the land if they know that as soon as the land is restored, it will be used to do something else? So land tenure is really important, really setting up the institutional framework for long-term and sustainable engagement. The next one is capacity building. We need to build capacity on the different type of restoration. As Tim was saying, restoration is not just about planting trees. We will never be able to restore through planting trees only. We really need to have a combination of different things, and assisted natural regeneration, for example, is one of the techniques that could be promoted a little bit more if we want to really reach scale. And we see that in some countries where it could be used, it's not used because it's not really known. We just came from Pacific Island, and it's really not a technique that is used, and it should be promoted more. So capacity building is really an important factor. Then the fourth one will be linking restoration with livelihood. How do we make sure that actually people benefit from restoration? Because we're not restoring just to restore because we like forests and we're tree huggers. Is how do we actually make this work for people? So that's a challenge, and that's really something we don't have a lot of. We keep saying that restoration is good for people, but we need example. We need to show that is really happening. The next point is financing. If you look at the cost of restoration, depending from one region to the next, but you can go up to $1,000, $1,500 per hectare. These are really, you end up with humongous numbers. So this is not an issue that can be tackled only by the public sector. The private sector needs to be involved. And how do we actually involve well the private sector? And one thing that hasn't been done very efficiently up to now is really doing the cost-benefit analysis of restoration. FAO just embarked now on a consortium to start working on the economic of ecosystem restoration, trying to prove that there is a case, because a lot of restoration happened, but there was not often the baseline that was done and then the cost-benefit analysis that was done at the end of the project. So we would like to work more on that. The next point is monitoring and evaluation. It's really linked to this cost-benefit analysis, and it's linked to something we'll discuss more later. But we need to really improve on monitoring and evaluation, and not only on the biophysical aspect of restoration, but on the social aspect of restoration. And the last point I will put forward is really we need time. Restoration doesn't happen fast. And usually donors projects are really short. We have 4 years to plan and start restoration. And I personally don't think this is how this is gonna work. We need to give time for restoration. So this will be the main point. I will see the main challenges that we have to overcome, and I will be happy to hear from others if they share my views.
Yeah. Great. So still many barriers that we have to overcome, and I think what Tim mentioned earlier regarding some of the lessons learned over the past 10 years can hopefully help us begin to tackle some of these challenges. Now, I know that with the decade, it gives us sort of a target point for starting restoration, but of course, restoration initiatives have already happened and have started. Most recently, a paper was published about the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact in Brazil, which by 2020 is expecting to have between 1 and 1.5 million hectares in recovery. So just saying that, you know, restoration is already undergoing. There are systems and there are monitoring systems that are already taking place. And how do we use these as a shining light to move the rest of our activities forward? Matilda, of course, you're now also helping to move along a project called the Restoration Initiative, TRI, which is also being implemented in over 10 participating countries. So perhaps you can share with us again, what is the aim of that project and what is it trying to help countries achieve in terms of restoration?
So the Restoration Initiative is a JEF-funded initiative. It's important to say that some donors are really realizing that restoration is a key issue and start investing heavily in this project, and it's a really good thing. It can be the German-funded IKI or the JEF or other donors that start investing heavily. The Restoration Initiative is a $54 million US, so really a consequent program that is co-managed by IUCN, UN Environment, and FAO. And we're really working as a consortium. The project is working in 10 countries, but as 11 projects because 2 projects are in Kenya. And there is a global component working on knowledge sharing and capacity building. What is interesting about this project is that we really pay attention to develop all the projects the exact same way. They have the same 4 components who actually answer some of the barriers that I mentioned before. And the project just started. Some projects are starting now, some started in September, so we don't have lesson learned yet. But what we have is the fact that we will have 11 projects following the same components, trying to go and do restoration at scale in 10 different countries in Africa and in Asia. So we'll be able to compare the challenges, and the country will be able to support each other through the global learning component, which is actually started and is working well. So in order to tackle the problem, we have 4 different components in each of the projects. One on policy and institutional setting. As I said, it's one of the key things, promoting coordination, promoting policy developments. One on implementation of restoration and initiative and livelihood development. So this is where the business case of restoration will also be made. One on financing and upscaling. But how can we actually work with country to tap more financing and private sector financing when possible? We might have really good example coming from some of the countries. And the last one on knowledge sharing. I think what is really nice in this project is we see that it has been 1 year, but we really managed since the beginning of the project development 3 years ago to really set up a core team with IUCN and UN Environment that is working. The tasks are really well defined, what FAO is doing, what UN Environment is contributing to in finance, and what IUCN is contributing to on policy and monitoring and evaluation. And it's, I think it's a nice model, and we will be able to in 4 years, have a lot of data. And something that is really interesting that might lead to the next topic is that we have a common set of indicators and monitoring and evaluation. And it's not only that we have the same indicators, but we will use the same methodology to follow up on these indicators, which means that we will have comparable indicators. So hopefully that will be a contribution to the major targets that are in front of us.
Great. Wow, very interesting. And you just mentioned it already that monitoring is sort of another element, and you said it was in one of the barriers, one of the 7 barriers you mentioned as well, that monitoring is something that we need to pay more attention to. within the TRI, how are the indicators being generated, or how is the monitoring component being tackled by the consortium?
So FAO, together with others such as WRI, IUCN, C4, have been working together for several years now on developing indicators for FLR. For the moment, they developed a high number of indicators, and we need to be better at having few indicators that are the most pertinent one, and they are working on this now. But for TRI, we've selected 5 indicators, some biophysical and some socioeconomic. The biophysical, we will be able to use Collectors Open Forest, which is a really good tool that will allow us to do the baseline of all the biophysical activity and be able to follow up on the implementation of the project. So for the one who don't know or are following the webinar, it's called Collectors Open Forest. You have a lot of information. It has been developed by FAO, and so you can check that. I think one of the major hiccup is how do we do for the social side? And so actually for this, I would like to get some idea from you and success story of how do we actually, because which indicator can you use? Because the level of income is difficult. We're trying to use some indicators. Are people more secure, food secure, for example? What is their safety net? Is the safety net better than before the project? But it's for the moment we don't have the golden bullets for the social indicators, and I think this is one of the key not to crack if we want to show that restoration is good for people and therefore should be really deeply invested on.
Yeah, I mean, Tim mentioned it as well regarding the need for a business case, but there's also a need for the social case and for the sustainability of any restoration initiative. That social case really is the underlying factor that needs to be figured out, I suppose. And I think a few different institutions have mentioned that social indicators are an area that needs more attention and more focus. So hopefully through the beginning or through this discussion, which is just a starting point, some more focus can be paid attention to that. Keeping on the track of monitoring and maybe even assessments, we are joined today as well by Dr. Tom Crowther and Dr. Jean-François Bastine. Both of them are professors, or sorry, Dr. Tom Crowther is a professor and JF is a postdoctoral fellow at ETH Zurich. They've had some quite high impact and well-publicized research come out quite recently, and there is another bullet in the chamber, if I can say it like that, but it is not released yet. So we might not be able to be too explicit on figures, but they have done some exciting research in collaboration with FAO and the Ministry of Agriculture, and with funding from the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries of Japan. So Tom, JF, thanks for joining us. Can you tell us a bit more about your work and what was the big question that you were trying to answer when you started tackling the topic? And Tom, there you go. You got it.
Great. So hey, thanks so much for the introduction. And I just want to start by saying that we entirely are, the premise of our research agrees entirely with what Tim and Matilda had to say, that really the goal of research now has to be inspiring action. And I particularly like what Tim mentioned about, the message has to be positive and locals, people can connect with it. But what sort of drives us is that we also think the message has to be quantitative. I think people, in order to really feel engaged in the message, you need to know what's the size of the problem, what's the size of the solution, and what's my part, what can I do in my garden or in my hectare of land or whatever. So we're ultimately trying to provide that quantitative picture that can just, really simplify the message for people at a global scale and at a local scale. So, to break it down to numbers, we're essentially framing our research in the idea that there's 300 gigatons of extra carbon in the atmosphere. That's the size of the problem. And obviously there's lots of climate change solutions out there that list ways to draw down prevent future emissions or draw down from that 300 gigatons. But ultimately, I think if you look at Project Drawdown is a really good organization for listing those top climate change solutions. They list, I think, effective refrigeration management with the potential to save 89 gigatons of future emissions is like the top one. And then a few down from that is if we all stop eating meat, we save 66 gigatons of emissions. But really the knowledge about where forests go in that list is it's not really that clear. So we're trying to generate that quantitative information to say, what's the potential for storage on land if we do manage ecosystems effectively, and what is available, and how can we act towards achieving those goals. So it's really everything that we're doing is that two-stage process. What is the potential and how can we do it? So really this research was generating a quantitative global perspective of where forests can be, and then by looking at the areas that are currently available for restoration, we can add up, sum up the areas and figure out what the potential for restoration is. And what we're finding, again, as you mentioned, we can't really release the exact information, but what we see immediately is that the results quite clearly place restoration far, far higher than the next best climate change solution, with considerably more than 100 gigatons of drawdown. And in fact, we'll be able to release those numbers in about a month or so. But it really puts that quantitative information there that can hopefully inspire people to go, oh my God, there is this massive solution, and I can get involved by donating $10 to this restoration project, or by going out and helping plant trees in some area. So I think that's my intro. Maybe Jeff wants to take over.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I think again, it was also mentioned a bit earlier that with each of these initiatives that we're starting, we have to take the lowest hanging fruit. So where we're going to restore, site species matching, all of that stuff is super important to ensure that we're being efficient in our activities. But also, we're really great to hear that the actual total potential is even higher than we maybe originally thought. It's rewarding, and also confirms the activities that have already been taken.
Right, and I gave a presentation a couple of weeks ago in the Gordon Research Conference Center on climate change mitigation and drawdown solutions, and I was the only person involved in natural ecosystem restoration or anything like that. Everyone else was direct carbon capture from the atmosphere, or geoengineering, or technological solutions. And when I gave my speech, sort of on the third speech in, I feel like everyone was completely floored. It was like it's like restoration isn't even been considered in that community as a real quantitative thing. It's like the nice, happy, clappy solution. But when I gave the numbers and was just like, these are very clear quantitative results, not only does that place restoration right up the top, there's this sort of concept of, I can't remember what the concept's called, but they all talked about this 5 wedges concept. I'm sure some of you guys might be familiar with that. And that the idea was maybe restoration could be in there as one of the wedges. That with the scale of global forests and the potential, we're actually showing that it could take out 2 or 3 of those wedges in one go. It could be a massively impactful solution if we were able to engage globally and get it going.
Well, we've still got lots of work to do in terms of selling our message. It's a valuable endeavor, and I know Tim has a blog that just recently came out, and he talks about the absolutely minute fraction of climate finance that is actually given to some of these sorts of initiatives. So lots of work still to be done in terms of communications and selling the idea.
Right.
One of the things with the Crowther Lab that is admirable is you guys combine a bunch of different fields of interest into the same lab, and you get geospatial experts to work with microbiologists, to work with ecologists, and it's resulted in some really interesting research. Now, the geospatial tools are going to play a critical role in restoration monitoring moving forward. Your lab has done a really nice job of combining both geospatial but also ground truth data, I think, from a global data set. So JF, maybe you can explain a little bit more about the methodology that the lab used to obtain some of these results, and maybe why it's more robust than potentially some numbers in the past.
Yeah, thanks. So the fact is that we were willing to quantify. So if we want to develop a quantitative approach, we need to quantify like how much trees we can have in any given set of environmental conditions. All right. So we needed, in order to develop that results, we needed to have observation of tree cover in many ranges of climate conditions. And the solution that we use to do it is that we used photo interpretation from geospatial data collected everywhere around the globe. So we were covering like tropical biome, boreal biomes, everything with all the ranges of tree cover. And basically, we're interested in trying to characterize those level of tree covers in environments where humans have the smallest impact as possible, because we were interested into trying to understand, okay, if we remove the human from the equation, like how much trees we can expect to get in any places. So we basically did this photo interpretation exercise only in protected areas of the globe, and we studied the relationship between tree cover, precipitation, temperature, elevation, topography, edaphic condition, etc. And then from that, we used like state-of-the-art technologies in order to develop a model which allows to predict those tree cover in all those conditions, and then to, based on those protected areas, and the model that we developed from those protected areas, we extrapolated the prediction to the whole globe in order to see and to have some kind of a benchmark and to see benchmark map to see how much trees we can expect to have in any place of the world. And so yeah, the state-of-the-art approach is we used a machine learning approach, and we took advantage of like the latest cloud computing technologies that are at our disposal, that you guys also use a lot with CPAL and stuff, so which is Google Earth Engine. And thanks to that, we were able to generate this global potential map of tree cover of the planet. And from there, then so this is basically trying to imagine the planet without human to see what we can have. But this does not give you a very realistic view of what you can do for restoration. So what we did from that step is to remove existing tree cover, so all the existing forests, and from that map, and to remove also all the farmland and all the urban areas, just to get a quick global overview of what can be achieved in terms of restoration. And yeah, this is pretty much what we did. In terms of result, as Tom said, we cannot really share the specific yet, but the paper is going to be published in Science as he said, in about a month. So just stay tuned. But what we can say, as I said, is that yeah, it puts like our results show that ecosystem restoration could be like the first climate solution, basically the first natural climate solution, but the first climate solution in a whole.
Great, yeah, thanks. So a little bit of a cliffhanger there. We'll have to wait for the publication to come out.
Sorry for that.
That's okay, yeah. But at least it seems positive, which is great. And I think on the methodology side, hopefully once the paper is out, people will be able to dig more into the impact of what that methodology is and maybe how it can be scaled to national levels for impact. So with that, I'll turn to Julian. The collaboration with ETH is actually a new collaboration with FAO. FAO already uses some geospatial tools as well, especially open data tools for decision making to support countries. And FAO uses a suite of online resources that have been mentioned a few times, such as Open Forests and CEPAL. So Julie, maybe you can tell us from your work here at the NFM team, how is FAO supporting countries with these kinds of open source tools?
Yeah, no, thanks, Khalil. I think similar to the restoration movement over the last 10 years, from mainly actually driven by REDD+, we've seen a huge effort, and we've learned a lot of lessons on supporting countries in building forest monitoring systems. And from the FAO side, we've developed this open forest suite that includes Collect Earth that Matilda mentioned. Also Collect Earth Online, developed with NASA, which is a crowdsourcing platform which brings in communities, I would say. And we also have CEPAL, which is our cloud-based geospatial platform where anybody anywhere can switch on supercomputers and do geospatial analysis from their mobile phones like they never have been able to in the past. So we've been working really hard on this for 10 years. We have quite a mature set of tools and platforms. And in the last 18 months, as has been mentioned through our Japan project, we've been trying to look within that suite of tools and platforms about how we can help countries do restoration, how they can plan restoration, and how they can measure and monitor it. And that's why we developed an agreement with ETH Zurich, because I think last August we realized that you guys were trying to answer the same question, around mitigation potential, around trying to find suitable areas for restoration. And we also have an LOA with Wageningen University, because they've developed a really powerful methodology called BFAST, and we've trialed it in a number of countries, and it is operational in the CEPAL platform. and it allows countries to really measure at quite a fine scale about whether their restoration effort is actually working. So it works principally to track fine scale changes in forest cover. So the degradation when the forest is being depleted, or the restoration when the forest is regrowing. So we've had great results from BFAST, and now our vision for CEPAL and open forest is that we put all these tools in a place that countries can access them. The algorithm that Jeff mentioned, we think this has a huge potential at the country level. So we really want to team up with ETH and bring this scientific technical approach that's operational to the countries, so they can do what they need to do better. They can answer the questions they need to answer with great clarity in a really transparent way. And yeah, so in the next year and a half, we'll keep developing these monitoring, mainly on the biophysical side, like Matilda said, which is probably the more interesting side for our team. We do work mainly at measuring the forest biophysical characteristics and helping country monitor those characteristics, and then helping countries with capacity development so they can understand the results, they can apply the platforms, and ultimately do restoration better, measure and monitor and report restoration efforts at more effectively. So in summary, that's what we've been doing for the last 10 years, and I think that's our vision for the next short term. And I think it can build quite nicely to the UN decade, because we have funding through Japan, and we're working on this, and we're working 4 countries on this with capacity development with partners like ETH Zurich and Wageningen University, and we can learn a lot of lessons and really hit that UN decade running on the monitoring side, on the biophysical monitoring side.
Great. So again, lots of investment in new tools that will hopefully be more useful for countries, and taking sort of this global approach that ETH is also working on, which I understand also has a country level aspect to it as well, in terms of pledges and the increased potential that maybe some countries have with their pledges. So yeah, really interesting to hear that the NFM team here at FAO will be able to tackle some of the barriers that were mentioned in terms of monitoring for restoration. We'll go back to Tim then, actually, to maybe cap us off with a few thoughts on the decade. So officially the start is 2021, and we've already heard that there's been 10 years of experience in the past, and there's ongoing restoration work going on now. So Tim, what does the development community really need to do, particularly in the countries, to ensure the decade will mobilize this on-the-ground action? I think at the last midterm assessment in 2014, the IPBES assessment showed that it was business as usual. So the commitments had not translated to on the ground. So what can we do to work towards ensuring the implementation on the ground is successful? Your microphone is just muted, sorry. Maybe Selena, if you can unmute Tim. Perfect. Oh, okay.
So thanks. Yeah, first of all, I think sometimes it can be useful to look back in history. History is the science of change. And we have some historical examples of when the kind of change we're looking for now did happen in a relatively short time, in a decade. There are several examples of where this was possible. The moonshot being one of them, the New Deal in the US being one of them, fighting the land degradation in the Great Dust Bowl in the prairies in Oklahoma in the US in the 30s and 40s is an example. So these the types of changes at the magnitude we're looking for have happened before in history. So studying how that was possible is, I think, useful for us as well. Then Matilda has, I think, outlined quite nicely the suite of challenges that we face. Those are they're pretty universal, I would say. In some cases, they're more pronounced in some countries than in others. But in the developing world, at least, these challenges are quite pronounced. What we can do to move the political will that is required to overcome these challenges is to build mass awareness and hopefully a mass movement. That will move the needle on political will, political change, and investments. So the best thing the decade can do is get as many volunteers as possible to start, and it almost doesn't matter where you start in the landscape, whether it's the local pond you want to restore in your school, as long as the decade can guide people towards seeing the landscape and making the connections, making the links, also how the city dweller depends on ecosystem services for water, for clean air, for food from intact landscapes. So the awareness that can be built by the decade will hopefully also help to build the political will to overcome the challenges we've heard about.
Great, yeah, so the decade is playing more than one role, obviously a communications and awareness raising tool, but as you mentioned, also a platform to connect people to how they can actually make a meaningful change in their backyard with their neighbors, and ultimately connect them to the ecosystem services that they rely on but maybe are not aware of through their landscape, which is fundamentally important for action to understand the importance of the various systems that you live upon. So exciting things, exciting to hear that the decade is open to having volunteers, and we'll be relying on everyone's action, everyone that's joining us today, academia, local implementers, policy change, all of it.
And if I can make one quick book recommendation, New Power by Jeremy Hymans is an interesting book about building social movements and platforms. I don't know if any of you have read it, but I'm almost through now. It's really, I think, giving us a lot of good advice on how we can tap into this potential using social media and the enthusiasm that is out there, especially among young people, to be engaged.
Great, yeah, and for the participants, we'll be posting a full list of resources at the end of the webinar, so that that book can be listed on there. The pamphlet that on the GPFLR, I believe that Tim also raised in the beginning, and hopefully also once the there you go, right there, yeah, and once the ETH Zurich publication in Science is actually published, we'll also share that document with everyone. We're getting very close to the end of our time for the webinar. Or for the digital summit. I wanted to make sure that we had a little bit of time to ask a question, at least one. So let's see. I'll just throw it out there, and if any of the speakers would like to tackle it, go right ahead. So let's see. Matilda, you rightly mentioned that we need to have improved collaboration, especially in the field, to successfully implement FLR interventions. Through the TRI, Jeff pushed on this multi-institutional partnership. So how can we create a situation where more donors push and prioritize and request similar joint implementation? That's from Benjamin de Ritter here at FAO. So that can be addressed to Matilda, but obviously there's connections to the other panelists as well, so feel free.
Our mics are on?
Your mics are on, yeah.
Okay, so I think that getting good results, showing that collaboration is getting good results can help us. We're also working with countries to create this synergy. I'm just back from Fiji, where we have been working with the CBD on a joint workshop, working on both forest and biodiversity focal points. And actually, we had all the Pacific countries together and their focal point, and they were really happy to start working together. So creating opportunities, more and more opportunities, and donors were invited to this meeting, the Korean Forest Services and also others, and they were really happy to see this coordination. So I think having good story and publicizing them is one of the way to have more support for this kind of collaboration.
Great. Anyone else want to respond to the question?
There is the Secretary General's Climate Summit coming up on the 23rd of September, and it has one stream on nature-based solutions. What we're trying to do for that stream is to make the narrative of our offer of investing in nature-based solutions more coherent and coordinated, so that it appears to senior decision makers, ministers of finance, heads of state, as a clear-cut area, just like the transition to renewable energy. I'm sure in renewable energy, there's a myriad of technical level questions and different expertise areas. But to the outside, it looks like a very clear-cut case. You switch from coal to wind and solar, job done. For land and investments in forests is not as clear-cut. And on the ground, it is quite a complicated field, as we all know. But we have to get together and be more coordinated, including with better scientific data that Tom and others are working on, to make the case that this is an investable area. So I think that the SG's Climate Summit will take us further, hopefully, along that trajectory.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tim. And I mean, if it's difficult and challenging for us to wrap our heads around, imagine those who don't engage in the land sector at all. So it's our job to obviously simplify these messages and make it an investable case, let's say. So with that, I'm not going to ask any more questions just because we are running out of time and we also have some pressure here to get out of the room. But I want to start by just thanking all 5 of our speakers. I think it's been a really engaging and nice conversation, although a short dive into various different aspects of ecosystem restoration and maybe not as detailed as some of the participants might have hoped. But I think we highlighted some areas where we're doing well and maybe some areas where we need to apply more of our energy and time. Greta Thunberg recently said that we already have all the facts and the solutions. All we have to do is wake up and change. So I think that that's pretty true for this decade, that we have elements that are ready to go. We definitely have some elements where we need to add some more energy and development, but initiatives have already started. They've been proving successful. And those successful elements, whether they're through the TRI, whether they're through on-the-ground activities, they need to really act as our guiding light. We have to take our lessons learned from them and begin to implement strategically in priority spots and grab the low-hanging fruit. I want to say thank you to all of our audience members or our participants. We're grateful for you sticking around for the whole time, which is our time, which is now approaching an hour. I want to ask that everyone continue to look out for all the resources that were mentioned, whether it's the publications, the book recommendations, some of the new tools that will be coming out with CEPAL and Open Forest over the next coming weeks and next coming months. Also, for your interest, this is just a 1 hour discussion, but there are some specific events that will be coming up over the next months. Specifically, next week, the FAO Asia Pacific Forestry Week is happening in Incheon, Korea. There'll be a whole stream number 1 on restoration, which I believe will be live streamed. So if you're interested, take a look at that. The ETH Zurich science publication will likely be coming out in July. We do have the GLF Bonn event, which is also coming up on the 22nd and 23rd in Bonn, Germany. So this is just the beginning of a discussion that's happened well before us and will continue after. I hope you continue to engage, get involved and share your thoughts, and continue to use these online resources and in-person engagements. I'll wish you a lovely remainder of your day and say once again thank you to Tim, to Tom, to Jean-Francois, to Mathilde, to Julian, and also to Meta for her opening remarks. Thanks, everyone. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.